We're going to continue the review of the colonial period, Unit 2, basically. We did the founding. Now we're going to kind of run through the big trends, big things that are happening during this time period that would probably be topics for essays, to be honest with you, and constructive responses and multiple choice questions. So this is actually the real meat of everything. All right, let's go. All right, so first of all, big trend we want to talk about is the evolution of labor slash basically the introduction of slavery. So going back to Virginia. Virginia, as we kind of alluded to in an earlier video, was a terrible place, the starving time. People couldn't survive. Much of the people who went there were kind of, to be honest with you, at the last, rung of society. These were basically people who had no other choice. England was a dirty, disgusting, filthy place with terrible food. The reality is this: if you were at the bottom rung there and you're out of options, you're coming here, there's a 50-50 chance you're going to die in the first year. That just speaks to the kind of people who were coming here. And they were coming here as indentured servants, just to make sure we know what that means. Um, you can't afford the ticket, so someone will pay for your ticket, and in return, you will have to work 5 to 7 years at doing labor. Now, each contract was a little different, but that's generally speaking the way it worked. Again, these are people who are at the bottom of society. They have no better option but to maybe go someplace and have a 50-50 chance of dying. In order to encourage this, another term we want to know is the headright system. So when Virginia finally got tobacco and up and running and were able to start making some money, they wanted to encourage development of land as much as possible. So the colonial government and the London Company came up with a plan. Anyone who brought over an indentured servant got 50 acres of land for it, which basically meant that you were basically being paid to bring people over. The goal was to, again, expand the amount of farmable land, but also increase the size of the colony as fast as possible. Now, indentured servitude was the common labor form for a very long time, but that will change. We'll see the introduction of things like chattel slavery. Um, Historically speaking, slavery was usually a temporary condition. You owed somebody money, you paid a debt, you might have been a POW, a prisoner of war, whatever it was, and then usually it ended. What made chattel slavery different was the basic emergence of you are now considered property, and it is now a lifetime punishment. Now, we studied in class these things called the Black Codes. These were essentially a series of laws that kind of showed this evolution of how labor and slavery was treated. If you remember, the early forms of the laws provided some basic protection for the people who were indentured servants. They were allowed to complain, they were ensured that their basic needs were met, all those things happened. But once we start seeing slaves and people from Africa introduced into Virginia and the southern colonies in general, the codes shifted, if you remember. They went from protecting the servants to now punishing the servants, limiting their rights. And the big thing I want to focus here is they started to define slavery almost basically on race. That the only people who were slaves were people of African descent. And that was a big shift. Now, why could it only be Africans? I think we kind of can tell, but the reality is this: they're an easy other. If everyone else in the colony is a white European, and it's really easy to figure out who might the slave be if they look physically different. Now, the culminating event that changes all of this is Bacon's Rebellion. I'm not going to spend all the time going over what Bacon's Rebellion caused and all this stuff, but the big idea is this. Nathaniel Bacon led a revolution of indentured servants in Virginia. They burned down Jamestown, which is pictured right down here in the corner, right? So they burned down Jamestown. The result of this, all right, of Bacon's Rebellion was, oh man, indentured servants are bad, right? Because they're degenerates and they're the worst people in society. So we should probably stop using indentured servants. Let's try something else. And then that's when you start seeing this huge bump in the amount of importation of slaves. So yes, that's how labor, we went from being a indentured servant society to now a slave society, especially in the South. All right, the next thing we want to make sure we understand is the development of the different regions, aka the origins of sectionalism, right? So we talked about New England in a previous video. Let's talk about it again. In terms of founding, all right, New England was primarily founded for religious purposes, right? Whether it was Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, there's a large control or large controlling factor of the Puritan Church. All right, geography, as we talked about a little bit in the other video. Uh, Climate, it is brutal, cold, harsh winters, short, mild summers, not ideal for agriculture. On top of that, there are not really mountains, but hills, and they're very rocky, and the soil's very thin, and there's these thick forests. So the big thing I'm stressing is that it's not ideal for agriculture. All right, who's the population? If you remember back to our DBQ, we talked about this. The fact that the majority of people coming over are already married and in families. There aren't going to be a lot of single men coming over, and more about that in a minute. So they're coming over as intact families, and in some cases, really big families, like seven, eight, nine, even bringing in some cases, the wealthy ones bring servants. So it also tells us the people coming over to New England are not poor, but actually quite well off and wealthy. There's this thing called a Puritan work ethic, right? This idea that you work really, really hard, but you don't flaunt your money, you don't throw your money around. And so one of the other reasons these people decided to come was they felt England was corrupt, and as business owners and business people, they felt like they were being cheated, so they wanted to come here. All right, economic activity. So it's not farming, as we know, right? But I said in the last video or previous video that it's all about the ocean. As you can see from up here, right? You see all these icons. You see boats. You see fish, right? The ocean is the heart and soul of New England. Um, at one point, I think about half the boats in the British Navy are going to be built in New England because they had such a lumber supply. Um, the other thing that's really important to remember here too is this: uh, they are going to create a rather large middle class. Right? There's not going to be this small number of elite wealthy people and then a huge percentage of the population being poor. There's going to be this middle class, and they're going to work very hard to maintain that middle class lifestyle because, again, they're coming as families, not as individuals trying to strike it rich. So, again, ocean, 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 trade, shipbuilding, fishing, all of that. And then settlement patterns. Last thing I want to mention really quickly is that they don't go and live on huge plantations. They live in small family farms. They tend to live in towns and villages. Again, that's going to feed this growth of the middle class. Every town needs a lawyer. Every town needs this. Every town needs that. And so there were people who could take those jobs and make a good living doing them. So we begin to see the development of like small towns. All right. And we talk, it's kind of this idea of like that whole New England town hall meeting that they're community driven, not individually driven. Now, Chesapeake Bay or Virginia, a lot different. Remember, it was founded by a company, right? The London Company for profit making. They're here to make money. The geography, it's further south, a lot of flat land, lots of river access, making it easy to then grow something and get it out to marketplace in England or other parts of the world, but mainly England. So because it's further south, their winters are more mild, their summers are long and hot, but guess what? That means more time to grow food. Well, not food, tobacco, right? So geography plays a big reason is they developed the way they did. In terms of population, I've already talked about it, but we'll just go over real quickly. We're talking indentured servants. They make up a vast majority of the population. So we're talking poor, degenerate men and a very small group of elite wealthy planters who own the plantations and will control government in the region. As I said before, one of the biggest problems with Virginia is they have no women, so there's no families. It's basically a whole bunch of single men. Um, any women who were around, well, they got snatched up pretty quickly. Lucky ladies. Everyone always dreams of marrying those kind of men. So yeah, not a lot of families, mainly single men and a few wealthy elite planters. Economic activity. All right, I think we already know. It's going to be plantations. It's going to be basically a small percentage of very elite wealthy people having all the money. It's all going to be centered around cash crops, really specifically tobacco. And that's kind of the model for much of the South, right? The South will basically take this model of plantations and then spread it out. All right, in terms of settlement patterns, all right, very few towns emerge. Why? Because plantations kind of can take care of themselves. All right, they can grow their own food, they grow the crops they're selling, they don't really need to interact. And also, they're really big. So your neighbor's miles away from you. You don't see them very much. So there's not that really strong sense of community. Um, and there also won't be a middle class because, again, middle class jobs, like professional jobs, need some place to be, like a town. And there just aren't towns for that. All right. So the thing I just kind of want to make sure we're getting out of this is, right, The South will enter in this agrarian society based around large plantations and elite planter society. The Northeast will be very different. They're going to begin to industrialize faster. They're going to have more middle class, small towns, small communities. It's going to be a radically different place. And again, this is going to feed the sectionalism, there's two different societies that's going to get us to the Civil War. All right, now we start seeing massive cultural changes. The major one is the First Great Awakening. So we haven't talked about it yet, but we will in a little bit. The Dominion of New England. All right, not to kind of get into it too much, but basically, um, there had been this change in religious views in New England. The Church of England had become more popular because of it. And so the Puritans begin to freak out and they decide that they're going to basically try to wrestle back control of their kind of theocracy. So part of that is the Salem witch trial, or just there were witch trials all over. This is just the most famous one. So the big idea you want out of this is that this is a kind of last gasp by the Puritans to try to wrestle control of these colonies and get them back under their thumb. Doesn't work. All right, then in comes George Whitfield or Whitefield. All right, he's a famous minister. He was an Anglican minister who traveled from England to begin to preach. Now, here's what made him different. What made him a changing, transformative figure was that the way he spoke about religion was very different. Before, it was this very rigid structure of ministers and this kind of hierarchy and almost bureaucratic system. He's coming in, he's telling people, you don't need to do everything these people tell you. You just need to be a believer in God and do good things, and you will be saved. And so when he starts preaching in the churches, Anglican churches in the South, they kick him out because he's basically calling them all hypocrites and attacking their way of doing things. And so what he does is then he goes into the fields and begins to deliver sermons as or what we call revivals. And he would attract thousands upon thousands of people. If you remember, this man walked up and down the colonies. He was the second most famous person in the colonies behind the king. That's how important he was. And so he will inspire an entire generation of people to basically create new churches, start thinking for themselves, things of that nature. The other famous person is Jonathan Edwards. We read the sermon in class. This was that image of this God, the idea that God is holding us as sinners, and the only thing that keeps us from falling into the pits of hell is this tiny thin string, and the flames are kissing it and basically trying to tear it anytime. So the message was this: one, you could go to hell at any time, right? It could happen in an instant. So what do you got to do? Get right by God. Figure out what you need to do to be saved. So what's that mean? Be a good person. Do the right thing. All right. So then his message is different than Whitfield. Whitfield's message was love and knowing God. Edwards was fear God. But at the core of them, what makes them united is that it's about you. You got to save yourself. All right. You determine your salvation, not some other group. All right. Not the Puritan church. All right. Now, out of this comes this fight between old lights and new lights. Old lights were the ministers who objected. They're the ones who kicked Whitfield out of the churches. They're the Puritan leaders who wanted to basically bring things back to the way they used to be. All right. The other issue was they typically got taxpayer money. You paid taxes to them. And so the old lights didn't want the system to go away because if that was how it was going to work, then they would basically go out of business. All right. Now, the new lights, they're embracing the Whitfields and Edwards messages of you save yourself, challenging authority figures. We talked about this before that all these new colleges are beginning to emerge to basically train these ministers. Now, here's why it's significant in American history, right? Um, Essentially, what we're seeing here is this idea, the seeds being planted in American tradition that, hey, here's an authority figure that we don't like, that we should challenge, that we should fight. And we should do that. All right. And so think about it, that's laying the groundwork in the seed for the revolution. The other thing it does is America's known for being ruggedly individual, I guess. Um, so now this sense of individualism, I do it, I'm responsible, is at the heart and soul of this movement. So then that idea will then permeate. Again, this overtook all the colonies. And so it's not surprising to see how this might have led to revolution on our part. All right. See you in the next video.